The release of Heretic by Raven Software proved to be a positive success. While not as popular as the game that its engine was based upon, it was apparently enough for Raven to turn up a sequel to their fantasy-themed first-person shooter. Now, of course, critics at the time would call Heretic a Doom clone with a fantasy theme slapped on top. But the sequel that they would develop turned out to be a much different beast in comparison. So much that the sequel takes place in another different universe. That's right, we are talking about Hexen Beyond Heretic, released on October 30th, 1995. Now, unlike the previous game, Heretic, Hexen seemed to be somehow more popular and more favorable for console ports, and more on that later, actually. Initially, Hexen was developed and released for the MS-DOS platform, but it also saw ports to the Apple Macintosh by Presage Software in June 27, 1996, and a port for Windows 95 would soon follow after in March 31, 1997, developed by Wild Tangent Games, which of course caught me by surprise as a youngster who frequently played game trials on their website during the 2000s. As a matter of fact, Wild Tangent is a name that people may be familiar with, since they have game trials bundled out of the box when you bought some Dell computer during the late 2000s. Anyway, just like the previous game, Hexen was also developed on Next Step computers. However, what makes Hexen different outside of the story is the extension of the Doom engine. This is done by the implementation of a scripting language known as Action Code Script, which is short for ACS. Kind of like its previous title, Hexen's development history doesn't really have too much documentation, but it was originally to be titled Heretic 2 early on. But I do feel like it was likely a good decision to call it Hexen given the storyline, and it will make more sense later. One interesting minor bit is that Hexen is German for witches, and also meant casting a spell when used as a verb. Looking back to the story of Heretic, which took place in Parthoris, which was invaded by one of the Serpent Riders, Desperal, who was later defeated by Corvus in the first game. Now, the story of Hexen is more so a sequel to the Serpent Riders storyline, rather than just an actual Heretic sequel. This time, it takes place in the world of Kronos, involving the second of the three Serpent Riders, Korax. Over the years, humans in Kronos learned that magic, despite being a powerful tool, can hold destructive potential more than any other force. Which of course leads to a more disciplined and orderly society where common men are enthralled by three ruthless, powerful leaders who are divided into three organizations. Zedeck, who is the Marshal of the Legion, Traductus, a Grand Patriarch of the Church, and Manelkur, the Archmage of the Arcanum. However, Korax, with his control of the Chaos Sphere, managed to corrupt the three leaders into his allegiance, and granted them the dark gift of unlife. Because of that, humanity quickly fell under their spell except for the three that you will play as. Baratus the Fighter serves as the melee-focused player class who is fast, buff, and isn't afraid of unleashing vulgar displays of power. Now, outside of going on a punching spree, Baratus likes to make use of melee weapons like the Timon's Axe and the Hammer of Retribution, which also acts as more of a powered projectile weapon at most. Then you have Parias the Cleric, who serves as a middle ground class, at least with the starting weapon being a bit weak sauce compared to the roided up fist that Baratus is capable of. I mean, can you really blame him? Dude can single-handedly cause extreme damage to a Cybertruck with only a single punch. Man, if only Booba can destroy a Cybertruck. However, Parias excels with average projectile weapons like the Serpent Staff that is capable of draining the health out of enemies, and then there's the Firestorm that shoots a streak of fire. Lastly, there is Daedalon the Mage. While he is the weakest of the two, he is a projectile heavy class reliant on mana and excels in long-range attacks. Unlike most typical arsenals in 90s first-person shooter games, Hexen has ultimate weapons tailored to the player, albeit assembled in three different parts throughout the game. Baratus uses the Quietus that is mana heavy but deals massive damage, especially up close. However, Parias carries the weapon that a lot of people like for being unique, which would be the Wraith Verge. It's a weapon that resembles a cross design that summons vengeful spirits to cause havoc on any enemy in its path. And lastly, the mage carries the Blood Scourge, a powerful weapon that shoots out 3-bladed fireballs that are capable of shredding through enemies, at least until the projectiles hit a wall or some other object. But not only the weapons in the game itself were portrayed differently, but so is the level progression. But before we get to that, I need to bring up the inventory system. Previously, Heretic had an inventory system that added a bit of gameplay flavor, with items such as the Wings of Wrath and the Tome of Power. However, it made its return to Hexen along with new artifacts and some returning ones. New ones involving the Disc of Repulsion that pushes enemies and proves to be pretty funny to use in multiplayer. Meanwhile, the Morph Ovum in Heretic was replaced with the Porculator, that turns enemies into pigs instead of chickens seen in the previous game. Now, depending on the class you're playing as, flechettes behave differently. The fighter would treat them as they were hand grenades, while the cleric would use them as gas bombs. Meanwhile, the mage would be using them more similar to the time bomb of the ancients seen in Heretic. Now with that out of the way, let's talk about the level design. Here's the thing, if you have ever played the game briefly enough, you will recognize that Hexen utilizes a hub system, with the first hub taking place after completing the starting level of the game itself, Windowing Hall. The single player for Hexen on its own has you going through 5 different hubs totaling up to 31 levels, and that includes secret levels. But it appears to be notorious for making the player feel lost due to how level progression gets treated like puzzles. And you may be wondering, what do I mean by that? Well, in order to complete the first hub of Hexen, you must hit a certain amount of switches just to unlock the exit entrance, advancing to the next hub of the game. But along the way, you would make multiple entrances to the various levels of the first hub, like Guardian of Ice, Fire, and Steel. Yes, basically, Hexen is one of those Doom Engine titles that allows you to transition between levels pretty much on the fly. I can vaguely recall dropping Hexen like several times due to how confusing it got, and I am not the kind of person who is willing to spend a few hours exploring an entire level figuring out where to go. Thankfully, I was finally able to complete the game, last year of course, but that is not without some anger and frustration brewing along the way. Of course, for those who are unfamiliar with me doing live streams playing through various games, I occasionally assist myself by watching playthrough videos and other guides. But of course, despite assisting myself in order to prevent my livestream playthroughs from lasting almost 8 hours per stream, Hexen with its ACS scripting language is prone to bugging out, and that pretty much came to a head when I played through the 4th hub. If getting ammo starved wasn't enough due to the swarm of respawning enemies, I had to force myself into using the no-clip cheat to enter the exit teleporter to the 5th hub due to a malfunctioning sequence involving ACS. Yeah, fuck you. Fuck this hub. Fuck you as well. And I'm not gonna bother reading that shit. As somebody who hates to cheat in video games, this was enough to have me crash out, and it soured my playthrough entirely despite being able to finish it. Granted, later on I did have to accept cheating in bullshit moments, like look at Chasm, because there's some moments where you have to be forced into using the God mode cheat or no clipping. So yeah, pretty much completing the 4th hub is pretty much a bullshit moment. And suffice to say, Hexen might not be a game for everyone due to various things, like the puzzle solving and shit like that. However, if Hexen is your thing, then long and behold, you have Deaf Kings of the Dark Citadel to play next. Now, of course I would have to bring up the soundtrack composed by Kevin Schilder. The music in Hexen, just like Heretic, shares a dark fantasy theme, with the latter focusing on a more slow atmospheric tone as opposed to a fast-paced melodic tone of their predecessor. But for my personal music taste, I feel like I had more liked songs in Heretic than I did Hexen. But I will say that my favorite tracks had to be from Windowing Hall, Guardian of Fire, and Shadowwood. It is also worth noting that Hexen appears to be one of the Doom Engine based titles to utilize CD Red Book audio for its soundtrack, at least as an option. To be fair, it's not entirely special, however, because it's nothing more than just audio recordings of the MIDI soundtrack, played on a Roland sound canvas. However, according to various sources, there may be some differences compared to its MIDI counterpart. But on the bright side around its release, it would have saved you the money having to be spent towards a actual MIDI synthesizer just for the soundtrack alone. Given you weren't a fan of the Yamaha FM synth that sound cards like the Sound Blaster use. but it's also at the expense of being lucky you even owned a CD drive in the first place, but also you would have to be dealing with some pausing whenever audio tracks were cycled. But I will note that this game, along with Strife, another Doom Engine title by Rogue Entertainment, are the only two Doom Engine games that are known for featuring multiplayer up to 8 players as opposed to 4. Now, this part of Hexen I seem to enjoy the most compared to single player, since the class you played really depends on your playstyle. Due to my aggressive playstyle, I would normally play as the fighter, because why the fuck not? Because I have to say it really. You know you're in for a good time when your opponent plays as the fighter, because its knuckles are so fucking powerful that over-competitive sweats would pretty much suffer concussions despite not being physically touched at the slightest. Like, dude can even punch the grass and the whole planet would shatter into pieces. But despite the multiplayer being rather interesting to play, it does suffer from lacking plenty of user content for it, and I would pretty much say it's less than Heretic itself. But unlike Heretic, Hexen appeared to get more popularity just enough to receive console ports to the Sony PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and the Nintendo 64. Personally, I only experienced the Nintendo 64 version during my childhood, but of course it appears to be the only console port to feature split screen up to 4 players. But unfortunately with that port, you will have to deal with texture filtering, which is something that does not translate well for sprite-based shooters. Which of course may contribute to why I back out on watching videos where people play GZ Doom with texture filtering on by default. But fortunately we may start seeing that dying out when people start switching to UZ Doom. But personally speaking, the texture filtering looks really disgusting that it's like the equivalent of smearing ass gravy on someone else's well-made painting and calling it improvement. Anyway, enough of that. One more thing I would want to bring up about Hexen's popularity versus Heretic is that outside of the console ports, Hexen appeared to be the choice for the finals of Deathmatch 95, as part of Microsoft's Judgment Day event. But if you are interested in learning more about the event itself, I do recommend checking out my video talking about the history of 90s subscription-based multiplayer services. But of course, what are my overall thoughts on Hexen? I do believe the game has its highs and lows in the single player, but I do believe the multiplayer is decent enough to be a fun game to add to your multiplayer session with your friend group, either at a LAN party or over on the internet. The latter you can pretty much do easily using Classic Gaming Arena and NukemNet. But if you like a more modern experience, I do recommend checking out Zandronum, which has support for the game, and the Night Dive Remaster, which you can pretty much buy for just $15. But if you're the kind of person who likes exploring around and going secret hunting while having the patience, then by all means this game might be for you. Otherwise, you might be better off sticking to Heretic. Anyway, that's about it for this one. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you got any thoughts on the game itself, then please leave me a comment. I would like to give thanks to my tiny amount of Patreons with a vocal shout out to Kuji and 8 Bits Apart. If you'd like to see this list grow and help support the channel, the link will be in the description down below. Thank you for the support, and as always, thank you all for watching and peace out. See ya.